Welcome to the biennial midterm election panel sponsored by the Nelson Rockefeller Center. I'm glad that you all got enough sleep last night, that you were able to come and do this. It wasn't quite the nail biter that it had been 2 years ago for good reason. Before we get started, and I wanted to just lay out what the format will be. We are being taped, so if you don't want the camera focusing on you, be discreet and so forth, tactful, respectful of your peers. And basically, I'm going to set the table for the conversation that the panelists will be having. I'll be introducing them. They'll each make remarks for about 8 minutes, and then I'll pose some questions to them, and then we'll be taking questions from the audience. And because we are being taped, if you have a question, you'll need to use a mic, and we have people from the staff of the Rockefeller Center who will come to you and hand you a microphone. I think the other thing I wanted to do before starting was to extend congratulations to our 2 Dartmouth students who were on the ballot in New Hampshire. Congratulations to both of them. And also to their names are Garrett Muscatel and Baronet Harrington, and also to the people who in this community who've been fighting pretty hard to ensure that students continue to have access to the ballot box in New Hampshire. So my thanks to all of you for your efforts on their behalf. And they themselves were pretty distinguished. The students turned out in goodly numbers yesterday, and that's all to be applauded. So our panelists today are in order of appearance: Dean Lacy, who's chair of the Department of Government and an expert on American voting behavior and public policy having to do with distribution of federal benefits. Next to him is Leslie Butler, who's an historian. And she specializes in the 19th century, and her presence on this panel is to illuminate historical parallels between politics in the 19th century with what we're seeing today. At the far end is John Campbell, a professor of sociology, and he writes a lot about political institutions and political economy more broadly. He recently published a book that talked about the kind of socioeconomic changes that led to the Trump 2016 victory, and he's going to talk more broadly about the patterns of change that he sees that are still influencing our politics and are likely to for a while. So let me just set the table here. I like this cartoon that Tolles had out a couple of days. Somebody's at a gun control store, but the ballot box is right next door, and this person says, no, they're not semi-automatic, but you'd be amazed at how powerful they are. So, and let's hope that that continues to be true. What's interesting about this particular election is that we've been in an era now of highly polarized political parties, getting more so after each election. And when you have parties that are so far apart, the stakes for winning and losing elections matter a lot more, because if your opponent wins control of the legislature, the policy changes are going to be much more perhaps costly to you than they might have been when the parties were closer together. Witness, for example, multiple efforts by the Republicans when they control Congress to repeal the Affordable Care Act. And what that kind of politics has meant that elections are being fought more and more fiercely. This year's midterms were once again record-breaking in terms of the expense, but also record-breaking in terms of the number of candidates that were running. But given this polarization and the fact that the stakes are so high, what we've witnessed in American politics is a very frequent changeover of control of the houses of Congress. In the last 12 years, Congress has changed hands 3 times. And that is just quite remarkable when you look at our past history. What that also means is that America is continuing to indulge its love affair with divided government, with all of the costs that go with that. when you look at the advantages that the Republicans and Democrats each had, or disadvantages going into the election, the maps favored Republicans. They had many fewer incumbent seats to defend, and they also had advantages in some key swing states because of gerrymandering, particularly North Carolina and Wisconsin. Those states have been in court, in fact, dealing with their districting practices. But history was on the side of the Dems because off-year elections usually cost the president seats in Congress. And so if you look at what the political advantages and disadvantages, both parties had things going for them, both parties had obstacles that they had to overcome. If you look at one of the things that counts most heavily in elections in America is the economy, clearly beneficial to the Republicans, although in my view they didn't make as much of it as they might have. But you also had the unpopularity of the president, although the popularity was quite variable. So in some states, the president's unpopularity was down in the low 40s. In a place like Indiana, where a Republican senator took the seat from a Democratic incumbent, Trump's approval was 51%, well above the range when it starts to be costly. It's no surprise then that this verdict is quite a mixed one. Both sides have something to feel good about, and both sides have things that they wished had turned out differently. Anybody who's looking for a policy message from this election should think again. And what you will find among our panelists is a marked reluctance to make any sort of predictions at all about what's likely to happen in Washington. We got burned in 2006, and us experts aren't going to let that happen again. Puzzling things about this election. You had states that elected very conservative Republican senators that also voted to raise the minimum wage. You had in Florida, where very hard-fought contests, where it looks like the Republicans might pull both the governorship and the Senate race out, but now there are some questions about this. But nevertheless, more than 60% of the population voted to restore voting rights for felons. So is that a conservative outcome in the state of Florida? Is it a liberal outcome? Both things were happening at the same time, and we saw much of that around the country. The last thing that I think, and this is the thing that for somebody like me who studies the institution of Congress, is the number of moderates continues to erode. Somebody's once said the middle is where the roadkill is, and of course the districts that were most heavily targeted were ones where you had incumbent House members and districts that Hillary Clinton had carried, and many of those incumbents went down for that reason. So overall, the results indicate that Democrats are repairing the deep hole that they found themselves in at the end of the Obama presidency. And you see that in some of the state-by-state results that I've put up here. So right now what we're looking at is 51 Republicans, enough to keep control of the House, 46 Democrats or independents. There are 3 races that are very close, like the one in Arizona. It looks like those are leaning Republican, but it's not possible. And then there's one with a possible runoff. In the House, you have 197 Republicans, 225 Democrats, and 13 races. This was as of 2:30 this afternoon, so some of the undecided races may change. It looks as if the undecided races will be leaning more to the Democratic, just as the undecided Senate ones are leaning more to the Republicans. You see Democrats regrouping where governors are concerned. They picked up 7 seats. They picked up a majority now of attorneys general, and they're still working on state legislatures. They came back a little better than 300 seats, but they lost 700 over the Obama presidency. So in all, it was a more average election than I think many of us were expecting in terms of the data. But of course, there are very many unusual features about it, and that's what some of our panelists will be talking about later on. But first, I'm going to call in Dean Lacy, who's going to do some things with numbers. Maybe one number.
If I could really do something with numbers, I would figure out who won in Florida. So, Florida, it looks like might have a recount again for at least the senatorial election, maybe the gubernatorial, or for at least the gubernatorial election, maybe the senatorial election as well. Before I get to this slide, remember that the framers of the Constitution invented this system that we had. They sat and thought about it for a long time, put a lot of thought into having presidential elections every 4 years and these midterm congressional elections in between them. And these midterm congressional elections create a phenomenon called midterm loss. It's one of the regularities in American politics. After 2016, I have no idea what to predict about American politics, but I could predict that the president's party would lose seats in the House of Representatives in this midterm election, because it always does. Since 1862, there have been only 3 elections when the president's party had a net gain of seats in the House of Representatives. 1934, the Democrats gained 9. 1998, the Democrats gained 4, and in 2002, the Republicans gained 8. So small numbers. But you've had net losses in the House of Representatives of 77 seats by the president's party in 1922, 72 in 1938, 64 seats lost in 2010. These are massive losses for the party to the president, and it seems to always happen. And for 2018, the number will probably be somewhere between 31 and 35. This midterm loss also happens immediately. I had a project with a student named Ted Schroeder we're still working on, where if you look at the vote in special elections where, say, a member of Congress goes to the administration or retires and there's a special election within a few months after the presidential election, if you look at the loss of the president's party in those special elections in congressional districts or in states for Senate elections, the president's party loses about 7 percentage points of the vote in the very first special elections that occur after the inauguration in January. And then that percentage decay in the president's party's support continues throughout the midterm election and then all the way through to special elections that occur after this. So if there are special elections to the House of Representatives that occur after this midterm, expects the president's party to do even worse. The presidential loss, or president's party's loss in midterm elections, is related to presidential approval. So here are the numbers. If you look at the president's approval rating, Donald Trump is right around 44% right now. And then you look at the net loss of seats, which is the vertical axis. You can see for each year what the president's approval rating was, and also what the net loss of seats were. The red numbers are Republican presidents. The blue numbers are Democratic presidents. That thick blue line is the regression line or best fit line, and that gray area is the 95% confidence interval. This is the only thing Donald Trump's done that's predictable, which is his seat loss in 2018 is exactly on that regression line. In other words, the seat loss is exactly what you would have predicted using this simple regression based on Donald Trump's approval rating currently. Now, there's another graphic floating around out there that shows that the Republicans, this is the worst loss of seats ever, considering how well the economy's doing. If you adjust for home sales, consumer price index, inflation, and unemployment, all those things working for the president, that this is the worst that a president's done. But you can see that most of the time the president's party is losing seats in the House of Representatives, and this one is right about where predict. This loss of seats is partly a preference of voters. 10 or 20 years ago, when political scientists started studying this phenomenon of divided government and midterm loss, we asked a question. I didn't ask the question, but the political scientists put on surveys a question: do you think government works better when it's unified in the hands of one political party, or when it's divided so that one political party can check the other in government? And about 45% of people said they prefer divided government. But then if you use responses to that to predict who actually votes against the party of the president in midterm elections, or who splits their ticket in on-year elections, there's no relationship. And so political scientists concluded that voters don't intentionally divide government. So in another article I have published with a Dartmouth student, Robert Ryan, it came out this year, actually just 3 weeks ago in a journal called Political Behavior. It's called Some Americans Want Divided Government and Vote to Create It. We use new survey techniques to, I think, hone in on the percentage of people actually prefer divided government. It's around 8 to 10% of the public. And that 8% to 10% split their tickets in regular year elections and vote against the party of the president in on-year elections. If you're interested in this group, they have a Twitter feed called The Davidist. It's one of the few groups that follows my Twitter feed, which has almost no followers, but The Davidist is a fan ever since this paper came out. Any of you fans of divided government? Anybody vote this way? I won't put you on the spot, but I think if James Madison and some of the other framers of the Constitution were here, they'd say, oh, me, because we call these people cognitive Madisonians. That is, they like the idea of checking the power of one branch of government with the other. And I'll stop there.
Leslie Butler. I'm going to put your slides.
I don't have slides.
I know, so I was
okay.
just going to,
block them?
well,
I
never mind.
didn't know. It was a slide party. I would have brought slides. Thank you for including a historian in this. I think it's actually really important to see the present day in historical perspective. So I'm happy to provide some of that. And also thank you to Satana and for Joanne for organizing and doing all the work for the panel. This was actually sort of fun to prepare for this afternoon. I have lots of thoughts about this election as a citizen, but I'm trying to think about it as a historian, so wearing my historian hat, this is the discipline that this required this afternoon to think about. So I want to just lay out two really broad overarching themes that I think are sort of helpful overarching themes in which to slot 2018. The first one is just the larger trajectory of what we might think of as anti-immigrant sentiment or nativism in American history, a real through line throughout American history. We see periodic waves of this going, actually back to the 1790s, but I won't take you to the 18th century, but for sure to the 1840s and 50s with the organization of the first political party that mobilizes around the question of immigration, which is the Know Nothing Party, otherwise known as the American Party, as they were called. That's a national party. They have strongholds in certain places, but it's everywhere, from Boston to New York to Baltimore, Cincinnati, Louisville, all the way out to San Francisco. So it has a real national presence. They express lots of fears that the real Americans, interestingly they call themselves Native Americans, were being swamped by new arrivals, right? So in that case, we were talking about the Irish and the Germans. In particular, this is post-famine, Irish famine, potato famine, 1845-46, and failed German Revolution in 1848. Huge influx of immigration in the 1840s and 50s. There's three main traits that I think the Know Nothing Party shows that have persisted, I think, when we think about anti-immigrant sentiment. The first one is a strong nationalism, we might call like America First sentiment. The second one is some kind of religious discrimination. In the Know Nothing case, it's obviously anti-Catholic. It will, in the late 19th century, be anti-Catholic and anti-Jewish. And of course, today we might think of Islamophobia as a really important strain of anti-immigrant sentiment. And then the third element that I think you see in a lot of these movements, you certainly see it in the Know Nothing, maybe not in the late 19th century, but is a kind of compelling anti-elitism. Either on behalf of a working class, which would be the Know Nothing movement in part, but also I think there's a cultural element. It's not just working class, but a sort of anti-cultural elites, experts. I mean, you probably hear where I'm going with that. So that's the first wave, 1840s and 50s. Of course, the late 19th century is an extreme wave of anti-immigrant sentiment. It's a little different. On the West Coast, it's anti-Chinese, and it affects both parties. Both parties are sort of caught up in this, and that will get nationalized in 1882 with the first actually pass a piece of legislation controlling immigration based on ethnicity, national origin, which is the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. In the East, it's much more just unease about immigration from really the 1890s through the 1920s. Mostly the Republican Party is doing this because the Democratic Party from the 1840s on is seen as the party of immigrants. The Irish and the Germans really flocked to the Democratic Party. If we kind of think more recently around the turn of the century, we could start maybe in the 1990s and think about I know the students, I thought I was going to be talking to mostly students, so prepared some notes on Governor Pete Wilson of California, but most people in the room probably remember Governor Pete Wilson of California, who, thought he would ride the immigration issue to the White House. It ended up not going very well for him. And after that election, you may remember Karl Rove got Republicans to moderate on the immigration issue, right? And he convinced Bush, you want to moderate on the immigration issue and build a Hispanic constituency, which seemed to work for a little while, but obviously Trump has abandoned that, completely from the very beginning. He declared his candidacy, by listing Mexicans as rapists and all of that. So that's kind of the large sweep. There's two quick sort of points within that I want to make, and then I have one more overarching theme. The first one is that it's only in recent history that we have the same party that's sort of friendly to immigrants and friendly to African Americans. In the 19th century, those were separate issues. So the Democratic Party was the immigrant party, and the Republican Party was relatively good on African American issues. Obviously, it was anti-slavery, and after that, it was certainly much better than the very white supremacist Democratic Party. Only with realignment in the post-civil rights moment do we have both those issues being in the same party, the Democratic Party, which is both friendly to immigrants and friendly on African American rights. So that's one point on that. The second point is that I think, without discounting the seriousness of the immigration issue, which does crop up as a serious issue periodically, I think we can sort of see it as a proxy issue for a larger set of concerns. And if you think about just to last week when we were all, watching in real time the invasion of the caravan, right? The caravan was coming to invade us, and we haven't heard much about that since Tuesday, you may have noticed. So I'm suggesting that it wasn't necessarily a real issue, but it was a proxy for a set of other issues. And I think if we dug into the electoral map from Tuesday, what we might really see is a widening of the gap between rural and urban / suburban voters. And that is something that we do see throughout. I mean, the 1920s is a good instance of that happening as well. There's a regional cast to it, but it's not a north-south cast. It's really and it's not a coastal versus flyover. It's really a city, a rural urban. And I think that helps explain some of and Dean can talk about this better than I can, but maybe some of the glimmerings of realignment we're seeing where places like Ohio seem to be becoming more solidly Republican. They have a lower college-educated population, and then places like, that used to be solid South, North Carolina and Georgia look like the states that might be flippable to Democrats. So there's a way that the alignment, I think, is working it's operating in a different set of axes. Okay, so that's nativism. I'll be much briefer on this one, which is just to say the second theme that strikes me, and that's been striking me for most elections in the past, couple decades, is this looming question over all of American history, which is how democratic is American democracy? How democratic are we really? How committed are we to democracy as a people? It plays a huge role. Democracy plays a huge role in America's sense of self, right, our identity, and has from the very beginning. But there's, in reality, on the ground, how committed are we? And, I'm not even talking here about the very, very large and tricky constitutional issues that raise very important questions of representation, the Senate, the Electoral College. You've probably heard those discussed. Those are very important, I think, and we've certainly tinkered with the system before. If you think about the direct election of senators, which happened in 1916. But I'm thinking here really more about basic questions of voting rights and representation. And that's another through line throughout American history, is a real deep and pervasive ambivalence about anything actually approaching what we might call universal suffrage. I think that's kind of a through line. I'm writing a book on this in the 19th century, so I'm thinking more about the 19th century, but if you look at our recent history, I think you see this as well too. You've probably seen the same headlines I have about I think the technical term for this is shenanigans, being played out with lines and certain, depending on where you live, how you vote, what voting looks like differs radically. And I think this is something that's worth thinking about. Now, Professor Fowler did mention Amendment 4 in Florida, which is a counter trend, and I think it's really significant. Several things happened on Tuesday counter to this anti-democratic, anti-voting trend. Amendment 4 in Florida is the biggest one. I wrote down here, the restoration of voting rights in Florida will actually re-enfranchise in Florida, a greater amount of people than the populations of Wyoming, Vermont, Alaska, North Dakota, South Dakota, Delaware, Rhode Island, Montana, Maine, and New Hampshire. So it's a really significant chunk of people, largely African American. There's also instances in Michigan and Nevada and Maryland of reinstating same-day registration or automatic voter registration. This is the question I'm sort of getting at, is the larger question of why in a country committed to democracy that founds itself on that, do we make voting so hard? Why do we have a political culture in which voting is so difficult? When we know that voter fraud, the incidence of voter fraud, especially in the 20th century, is minuscule. So that's just the question I would sort of say, this election and seeing the recounts going on in possibly in Florida and Georgia, places, and actually I should have pointed out, Supreme Court decision of 2013, Shelby County v. Holder, which removed federal oversight of former Confederate states and how the shenanigans they employ with voting. So that has been a pretty significant change in our own era since 2013. So I'll stop there.
So, that's wrong. That's better. Trump and the midterms. I just got back from Washington, D.C. today. I was down there for a few days with a bunch of Europeans. They can't believe what's been going on in the United States. But they do agree that what's been going on in the United States for a long time has been going on in fits and starts in the European context, which I will not talk about, maybe in the Q&A. The story that I want to tell is a two-part story. One is, this is a very quick rendition of this book that Linda very kindly mentioned that I published recently, How Donald Trump Got to the White House. And in a nutshell, it's a story, in my view, not about James Comey, not about hacking and Russians and all that, but it's a story about long historical trends in the United States, at least since the 1970s, of which there are four basic ones that are important for the midterms. Economic stagnation in the United States. For the median income group and below, it's been a flat line since the mid-1970s, and you may have seen recent newspaper reports that economic wage growth is now about 2.5% this year. Actually, it's a little bit less than that. It looks like it's getting better, and it is, but it's minuscule relative to 40 years of stagnant wage growth. This is one of the trends, obviously, that Donald Trump ran on: make America great, raise wages, et cetera, reduce individual debt, which people had to incur because their wages had stagnated, but prices continued to go up, so they had to borrow to close the gap. Trend number one. Trend number two, which is not unrelated, a history of racial scapegoating in this United States, which goes back long before the 1970s, but which took on particular tones, particularly since the 1970s, as working class whites in particular started to blame job loss, wage stagnation, et cetera, on first African Americans, then immigrants, and then you compound that with the 9/11 attacks, and it puts Muslims in the crosshairs too. So this anti-immigrant sentiment growing for a considerable period of time. That's trend number two. Trend number three, again, we can trace this back to the late 60s, early 70s, a gradual shift in how we think about the economy, shifting in a rightward direction. We would call this neoliberalism. Some people call it market fundamentalism. But the bottom line is, how do you deal with our economic problems? There are three solutions. If you do them all at the same time, life is going to be great, and we can make America first again. Cut taxes, cut government spending, deregulate the economy. And this has gradually, beginning in the academy among economists, gradually got to policymakers. They started to buy into this, gradually seeped into the American psyche, if you will, and it's sort of taken for granted knowledge among most people in the United States. Yeah, our taxes are too high, government spends too much, and there's over-regulation, and we should do something about this. I would argue, not here, but elsewhere, those three trends combined to precipitate the political polarization that we see in the United States today, which has been mounting. Took a big uptick in 1994 with the Gingrich Revolution when the Republicans gained control of the House of Representatives for the first time in 40 years. Long story short, this all reaches a tipping point. Obama gets elected, financial crisis hits, Dodd-Frank, Obamacare, Wall Street bailouts, bail out the automobile industry. All this runs very counter to everything that I've talked about so far, and it sort of sets the table for Donald Trump, who plays his cards brilliantly, I must say, captures the White House. What does this have to do with the midterms? Economic stagnation is a big piece of this story. And of course, the Republicans, to the extent that they ran on economic issues, said it's all working, right? 2.5% 2.5% wage increase over the last year or so. It's working. Jobs have been coming back. It's working. Now, the Democrats didn't do a very good job in countering here. The reality of the situation is unemployment rates are going down, but this is because people are working part-time jobs. They found underemployment rather than the kind of jobs that they would want. Some people are actually working 2 jobs where normally they would have worked 1 job. So there's an upside and a downside to the economic story, which played to an extent in the election. The stock market is up, but that's only good for a certain segment of the population. So that economic stagnation story continues to play, and it did have impact on this election. Racial scapegoating, of course, was a huge issue, and Trump brought that on like gangbusters with the invasion, the caravan, and it turns out it wasn't just an invasion of folks from South America, it was an invasion of people from the Middle East that had snuck into the caravan somehow miraculously, paid for by the Soros Fund, apparently. Although it sort of struck me as unusual. George Soros, an extremely wealthy guy, couldn't buy buses for this caravan. He made them walk. Didn't quite catch that. But the point is that the racial scapegoating that we've seen for a long time played big in this election. Conservative ideology did as well. The tax cut, the attack on Obamacare, the Democrats defending Obamacare, and trying to remind people that if you repeal Obamacare, oh, by the way, pre-existing conditions comes back. Those kids that are on your insurance because they're still not 26, that might go away. So conservative ideology is important, and of course, political polarization did not go away, and arguably it's been exacerbated by the election returns. Bottom line, in the big, broad scheme of things, not that much has changed. And so if I was going to predict, which I would not do, but if I was going to predict, I would say we're going to see more of this for a while. I'm not entirely optimistic about this. So there we go.
Well, I'm going to pose a few questions to the panelists. One of the things when we met this morning to talk about this was, well, we were all sort of saying a lot of what we saw is fairly predictable and consistent with other patterns in the country, but there are things that are different. So I'm just going to ask, Leslie mentioned a few things that she thought were different, but do you have anything you want to add to what you thought was different?
Well, I mean, one thing we did talk about this morning is, and it's the happy story, which is all the firsts, right? 2 Native American women, 2 Muslim women, first black woman from Massachusetts to be elected to Congress. So there's first LGBTQ candidates win elections. So I think that actually makes the story I was telling about these divisions between rural and urban probably exacerbates that, because it's happening in the urban areas and not in the rural areas, which are becoming. I mean, I think there's a way that you can kind of see that as part of the fears and anxieties in certain sectors of the country are exacerbated by these kind of exact trends, and those are Democratic capital D victories.
Dean, what would you add to that?
Usually when presidents suffer this midterm loss, they moderate. And if firing Jeff Sessions the next morning is moderating, then I think we're likely to see something different in the response from Donald Trump, and that is it plays to his strength, which is the reaction, almost being a victim of the institutions of the big media, and I think you won't see him follow the pattern of George W. Bush or Barack Obama, who moderated after their midterm losses, and this might embolden him to move further to the right, especially when his critics in the Republican Party in the House and Senate lost many of their elections.
There's nothing like a constitutional crisis to distract from a narrative election narrative you don't like, I suppose.
So what were the Europeans saying, John, when you're about what looked like it was different from what they're used to thinking about American politics?
They're perplexed, and I have to be honest about this. They're very worried about this. I was speaking to Scandinavians for the most part, but I also spoke to some folks in the World Bank. And folks at the World Bank listed 5 big areas of global risk that they perceive right now that are sort of urgent. Financial stress, trade tensions, geopolitical security, and political uncertainty. And I can't remember what the 5th one was, but those 4 you can trace right back to the United States right now. And the Europeans were concerned that there are no indications that we could see where this election resolved any of those. So they're making policy changes over there based on these sorts of perceptions about what's happening over here.
So one of the things that struck me is how many veterans ran in this election. There were 170. And we went through a long period, well, right after World War II and through most of the Cold War era, the number of veterans serving in Congress was very high. And in fact, in many parts of the country, if you weren't a veteran, you'd better not think about a political career. But we got away from that in the 90s and in the 2000s. And now we seem to have quite an interesting crop of vets in both parties. And many of them are female. We've talked a little bit about the nationalizing influences of party. What were you saying? Used to be all politics is local?
Politics has become nationalized. These midterm losses are national phenomena. It's every election is its local characteristics combined with some national tides, such as midterm loss. And I think with the loss of some moderate Republicans and critics of Trump, and the pull of the Democratic Party, I think probably further to the left, you're seeing the widening polarization. There are some exceptions to this. Joe Manchin winning his Senate race in West Virginia by a large margin, but in a state that voted for Donald Trump by a large margin makes one think, well, what is it about West Virginia? And what does it tell us about the way people think about parties? To me, and I would be an outlier among academics on this, it proves, I think, that party identification isn't about a team spirit. It's not Red Sox versus Yankees. It's not our emotional attachment to red or blue. It's how we think about issues, national and local issues, and how the candidates line up on those issues. That's how you get a Democrat like Joe Manchin out of West Virginia in a state that votes reliably Republican.
Right. Do you have anything either of you want to add to that?
Yeah, I read, I don't know if this is true or not, but I read that depending upon how big the Trump victory was in 2016 had a big effect on the strategy that the Democrats ran on this time. So that if it was a wide margin, it was a very serious Trump country, they would run on local issues. I'll fix your potholes, I'll make sure the roads are plowed, and so on and so forth. But if it had been a tight margin, they'd go after Trump. I don't know if that's universally the case.
Although in Michigan, the governor was "fix the damn roads" was her slogan, if you recall. She won. Yeah, but
right.
I think more generally, what you're saying is accurate.
And it worked in some. Phil Bredesen in Tennessee did not want national attention, the national attention that Beto O'Rourke got in Texas. I mean, Bredesen was like, "Please don't come here." It didn't work. And Gretchen Whitmer, incidentally, was my neighbor when I taught at Michigan State.
Okay.
So that was kind of cool.
One of the things we talk a lot about in electoral politics is the role of money. And this year was different in the sense that you had, in the Texas race, you had the big money raiser was Beto O'Rourke, who never took a dime from PACs. And he raised, in the end, $40-some million online. It was really, and there were other candidates. And what you saw, there was a tradition, and in fact, the Democratic Party operatives were a little troubled by this because they had their strategy of the races that they wanted to back, and they were focusing on the districts where Hillary had won and Trump had lost with Republicans. But there were a lot of people sending money to various organizations, whether it was Emily's List or other kinds of groups, and they were backing people that the party hadn't really been comfortable with. And you had a couple of Democratic primary elections influenced that way, where the party money was behind the person who lost, and the activist money was on the person who won. So I think the web has really, it certainly hasn't diminished the importance of money. If anything, this was a hugely expensive election. But it has meant that when a group of people is mobilized, there are avenues for them to put money into the races. Now, I was saying with Texas and Florida and Georgia, well, the super PACs, the big Republican PACs, haven't gone into these states yet. And when they do, it'll make a big difference. And they did, and the ads were all-consuming and extremely negative. And they may, in these really tight races where you only have to flip a couple of thousand votes, they may have made a difference. But this was one election where I think money mattered less than in terms of the disproportionate ability of the two parties to raise money. And of course, it's now the case that Democrats have their own billionaires. It's not just the Republicans. It's not just George Soros, it's Tom Steyer and a couple of other folks. The playing field isn't level, but it's not as uneven as it used to be. So are there,
The money in politics thing fascinates me. And the data that I recall are about a week old at opensecrets.org, where they track this based on Federal Election Commission figures. And the official campaign spending at that time by the campaigns and the political action committees affiliated with was for the Senate and the House races was, I think it was about $3.1 or $3.2 billion. And the Democrats, and I don't know if this is on a per race basis, but the Democrats had more than the Republicans did. But, so that's about 3.2 or 3.1 billion there. Overall, the projection is that about $5 billion will be spent when all is said and done on all these races. And so the question is, where's the other money coming from? It's this so-called dark money. And there the Republicans outspent the Democrats 10 to 1.
Right. So for those of you who think about donating to campaigns, it's much more efficient in terms of your dollars to give to the individual candidates because they get more favorable rates in terms of booking ads. It's much less efficient in terms of a dollar if you give it to a group or to a super PAC that have to pay higher rates for advertising. But that said, and that's exactly what I thought was probably going to happen. The Democratic candidates did an amazing job of raising money against incumbents, which never happens. Witness Beto O'Rourke and Ted Cruz. And you'd think that Cruz, sitting in a Republican in Texas, would have not had as much difficulty. But the scales get tipped when these heavyweights. It's often the case, though, that the heavyweight donors that come in late, sometimes they suck the air out of a campaign, and the person they're trying to help actually gets drowned out in these late ads or is being depicted in ways that are actually not comfortable for the particular candidate. So it's a mixed record this year, but not as uneven as it has been in most contests.
Can I just say one other thing, sorry, Dana,
Yeah.
about the nationalization of politics too? And we talked about how many women were running. I guess we talked about that this morning. We didn't talk about this yet here, but so many women ran for office for young women too, and that is very much about the nationalization of the response to Trump's election in November. Because some of those organizations, I think. her last name's Littman, I think it's Amanda Littman, started an organization called Run for Something that was geared, I think, towards young people, maybe towards women, I can't remember. But they, recruited people starting literally in November of 2016 to run for office. And that is a national issue. It also pooled money. And one other little funny fact that relates to indirect voter suppression efforts was another nationalization of money was the pizza for polls. I don't know if anyone saw that, but if you were stuck in line and you, on social media, you took a picture showing that you were in one of these obscene, 2-hour, 4-hour lines, this national organization, took money in. You could just contribute. You just had to text it and give your credit card. Really easy to contribute. And then they would find a local pizzeria and send pizza to the polls. My sister did this in Chicago, so I know it actually worked.
Oh, that's great. So I think now it's time to hear from you all. If you want to raise your hands, and we'll direct people with microphones to find you. I'm going to give preference to students because that's my prerogative as chair. So let's hear from you. We'll bring the mic down here,
Send here,
please.
second row.
In the green. Dartmouth, Switzer.
Hi, I'm Jasmine. I'm a 19 here at Dartmouth. So I think what was notable to me for this election was the efforts to get out the youth vote. So I'm wondering, and I'm asking, to what degree did the youth vote affect this election?
It's hard to say because unlike presidential elections, the congressional elections are just more fractured and there's still counts going on. We won't get turnout data. The youth vote, every election, the parties put more and more effort into getting the youth out to vote, and the turnout blips they get from it are rather small. But I think one of the ironies, what I was going to say about money in elections, is even though more money is pouring into elections, it's so much cheaper and easier to reach voters now than it's ever been before through social media and other free media devices. And I think campaigns are starting to realize that you don't put an ad on the evening news to win over the youth vote. You need to get out on Twitter, and Facebook is even so, 5 years ago.
You have to snap it.
Yeah, Snapchat, whatever, yeah. And it's also these social networks, it's word of mouth, and I think the parties are starting to understand that.
Certainly in Arizona and a couple of other states with early voting, I think in Arizona, youth early voting was 400% increase.
I saw 31% of voters 18 to 29 cast their ballots, which is a 56% increase over 2014. And is actually the turnout was pretty staggering all around.
Yeah.
So, but the youth vote was nearly double the 31% increase of the electorate overall from 2014. So the youth vote, and I think Dina's right. I don't know. You probably saw a bunch of these ads, but at the risk of polarizing this room, they were geared towards students by really calling out the grandparents, right? The gerontocracy. There were very funny ads going around online about don't vote. Old people telling them don't vote. We're good. You don't need to vote. So humor was a really important element of this election cycle, and it just a very different strategy and probably a lot cheaper too than the typical ad buy. So it sort of opens things up quite a bit.
But the other thing I'd add about youth participation is there are more younger candidates
Absolutely.
right now, and I think younger voters are now becoming younger candidates, which is great.
Ocasio-Cortez is 29, right? It's very
I
young.
think in the 2014 midterm elections, 75% of the electorate was a senior citizen.
It's amazing.
And that really needs to change. Other questions here? Oh, we've got the mic down here, so we'll go with one more.
There's another mic up.
Okay, great, thanks.
Hi, I'm Kyle. I'm a 22 here. My question is, do you think that either party can take policy sort of decisions from this election? The Democrats, sort of have a tension between the Bernie wing of the party and the Clinton wing of the party, for lack of a better term. Do you think that one of those sides won out in this election? And for the Republicans, do you think that they know which direction, moderates or sort of more Trump wing Republicans, which wing they should go with as well for electoral success?
think the Trump wing of the Republican Party is winning. And I would say there's very little doubt about that. On the Democratic side, I think it's less that the Sanders wing of the party is winning as much as it is that the Clinton wing of the party is fading. And the Clinton wing of the party started back when Bill Clinton was governor of Arkansas. It's the moderate, third-way Democrats who are fiscally conservative, a little more socially liberal, mostly running from in the South. And I think that wing of the party is disappearing. We're not going to speculate about the next presidential election. We swore we weren't going to do that. We're not going to do that at all, right? But the Democratic Party right now is kind of a pile of rubble waiting to be pulled together by somebody who can unite. And it's always been that way. There's a quote I love from a Theodore White book, The Making of America, where he said the Democratic Party is this 8-headed hydra, and you can never get all 8 heads looking in the same direction. It's like the academics, the students, underrepresented minority groups, women. And he listed all of them and said if you can ever get them facing the same direction, the Democratic Party would be a formidable force, and he hadn't met a candidate yet who can do that, and I think that's still true. He wrote that about the 1960s.
I do wonder. I mean, I know that's also like the circular firing squad, right? But I think that narrative has so dominated that I think we actually underestimate and I mean, I actually think Senate Democrats and House Democrats have been extremely laser-like in their focus this past year and a half. I mean, I've been really surprised. And this campaign, I think, I think they've also been very disciplined. It hasn't sort of gone off the rails or that's the joke, and everyone's like, oh God, wait till the party comes and what will they do? But it actually didn't happen. So I'm intrigued by that.
But it is the case that with so many people coming into Congress now from suburban districts, that it's going to be a challenge for the party leadership to try to keep everybody on the same page. I'm not sure they should be on the same page. I'm hoping that whoever the leader is going to allow these suburban Democrats some leeway and not have to walk the plank for the party. That, we still have a geographically based representation system, and to treat it, and what's happening now, the elites are trying to graft a parliamentary style system on top of our first past the post geographic constituencies, and it just doesn't work very well.
It's going to be interesting to see what happens now that there's so many women that are in Congress, because the comparative politics literature shows that legislatures that have a higher percentage of women in the legislature tend to have more progressive policies, particularly on social issues. Now, if you sort of extrapolate from that to what's happened in this last election, I think this is going to cause, great that there are more women in the legislature, but this is going to pull part of the left farther to the left within the Democratic Party, and that creates problems down the road for the Democrats.
One of my
But it may focus their policy attention, because one of the things that was lasered in on in this election was health care.
Absolutely, and that seemed like a bipartisan issue. If you were
Exactly.
Lots of Republicans campaigned on Obamacare, essentially. So now we know the thing they didn't like about Obamacare was Obama, right? I mean, so pre-existing conditions was everywhere.
Yeah.
So in answer, Cal, to your question, I would say, it sounds like, wow, we're really headed towards a more robust version of Obamacare. But of course, Democrats don't get to make policy as one part of one branch. So I think we're probably headed for. I'm not going to predict, but I'll say dysfunction and a sort of partisan gridlock. But if you were smart, you would just keep recording over. Although we've also learned we are now in a post-shame era of politics, where you can say one thing Tuesday and say another thing on Friday, and no one seems to think that's problematic anymore. Of the things I'd like to bring back from the 19th century, shame is really high on my list.
Well, it's interesting that when women were agitating for the franchise, there were major cartoons, of course, about why this was a terrible idea, but my favorite one was of a woman with an apron and a hat on, or a dust cap or whatever, with a big broom. And the idea was that if women get into public office in significant numbers, or if they have the vote in significant, they'll clean up politics. So there's a big burden, and we saw it with the pressure on Susan Collins that there's an expectation in the public that women will do the right thing. And what happens if they do the political thing? So I'm waiting to see how that will play out. Okay, we have the mic up there. Who can you get to easily? Okay, just pick somebody up there. There. Okay, thanks.
What impact did the money generated as a result of the Citizens United case have on this election, and what's it going to take to get Citizens United overturned?
Well, Ruth Bader Ginsburg needs to not break any more ribs, for starters. I would say.
Well, I mean, I think that it certainly contributed to the influx of dark money into this campaign. For those of you who don't know, dark money is money that you can raise it in unlimited amounts, you can spend it in unlimited amounts, and you do not have to report to the Federal Election Commission where the money came from, as opposed to other forms of campaign finance. So it's dark money. And those numbers have been increasing, and I think that's partly to do with Citizens United.
It's a very small number of people,
Yeah,
like 11.
yeah.
Other questions? Yeah, up here, Peter.
I'm Pete Belisler. I'm a 61. And my question is, what did the Kavanaugh hearings, what effect did that have, if any, on this election?
You know, I actually thought about this Tuesday night, and I think it's very mixed, and I'm going to forget all of this, but people were asserting a lot of things Tuesday night about, Heidi Heitkamp lost, that's why. But, Dean Heller lost too, right, in Nevada, and he voted for Kavanaugh. Phil Bredesen wasn't in the Senate, so couldn't vote for Kavanaugh, but said he would have voted for Kavanaugh. His opponent, Marsha Blackburn, didn't vote for him either because she was in the House. So, that, and then I thought Manchin did vote for him, and so Manchin won, but I think it's hard to generalize because it seems so variable, the sort of people, I don't think you could generalize, so it's hard to say. I mean, I think you'd have to really dig down in exit polls on thinking about suburban women, maybe, more traditional conservatives, religious conservatives. I think for a lot of religious conservatives, that was a really important motivating issue. But I think it's hard to say in terms of which senator went down or didn't. I don't think there's a clear impact.
I'm guessing it increased turnout. That's speculation, but they didn't
On both
help
sides,
one
maybe.
party or the other disproportionately.
Want to take another Pete?
I'm Pete Frederick, 65 from here. Listening to you all speak, I find it interesting that you said that politics is not local, all politics is not local. Is it perhaps all politics are now personal? If you look at the description, we talk about the number of women, the number of Muslims, the number of African Americans. We don't talk about the number of conservatives or pro-gun or pro-choice. And it used to be that was the reason you voted for someone, because of their position. And I'm afraid that perhaps after the 16 election, we now vote for or against someone because of their personality. Is that true? And if it is that a problem?
I would argue that I wouldn't phrase it quite like that, not in terms of personality, but it's definitely, we've moved into an era of identity politics, which has divided us along racial, ethnic, religious, regional, gender, et cetera, lines. Whereas maybe 2 or 3 generations ago, there was some of that, but there were clearer class-based, economic class-based divides, I think. There's been a fragmentation in the electorate, I would argue.
I mean, maybe it's exacerbated. TV certainly makes it worse, but I would say identity politics has been part of American electoral politics from the beginning. I think the Democratic Party was the white working man's party in the 19th century, and the Republicans, the Whigs, and then the Republicans were kind of the moral party. Look at Al Smith, 1928, to go back there, right? Irish Catholic, running for president. I mean, that's identity politics. You should see the electoral map in 1928. I mean, he flipped a lot of states against him for being Irish Catholic. So, you know, I'm not sure that it's such a recent thing. I think, you know, Trump has certainly exacerbated that, as he's exacerbated almost every trend, I think, in American politics. And TV, I think, certainly makes it worse as well, because, you know, we see, but character and personality, you know, Teddy Roosevelt, I mean, this has always been personality has been part of American politics from the beginning, though I do think seeing people on TV makes it worse. Makes it not worse or better, but makes it more pervasive.
We're going to put in another plug for a paper I'm working on with a Dartmouth undergrad, because I've done two. Here's a third. A student named Alexander Agajanian, who I had in a class last year. We were talking about how people's identities can change based on their partisanship, and there are certain variables like age. Your age doesn't change depending on who you vote for. As much as we'd like it to be true, it's not, right? Evaluations of the economy, whether you think the economy is doing well or poorly, largely depend on whether you're a Democrat or Republican and the president's a Democrat or Republican. We see the world in different ways. And I asked the class, what about race? And a student found a survey from 2011 to 2016 where people were asked their racial identity in 2011 and 2016. 5% of the sample changed their racial identity in that 5-year period. And we don't think that should happen in most surveys. Usually we ask race in the first wave of a survey, and we don't ask it again because we don't think it changes. And that 5% that changed in a way that was consistent with the change in their party affiliation. People who in 2011 said they were multiracial and voted Democratic in 2016 said they were white and voted for Trump. People in 2011 who said that they were white and voted for Mitt Romney, then in 2016 said they were multiracial. Some even said they were black or Hispanic, not even multiracial, but switched race, and said that they voted against the Republican, they voted for Hillary Clinton. Our identities, group-based identities, are becoming so closely intertwined with partisanship in ways that hasn't happened, at least in my lifetime. I think you'd have to go back to
19th century.
19th century.
Okay.
I'm Ross Reese. I'm sort of a town person. When you were listing the factors, trends taking place in the world, I had some fun writing down other trends. I know you didn't intend your list of trends to be exhaustive, but it does impress me the number of trends taking place. And I had number one on the list, technological changes, not in voting procedures, but in the economy and sociology. And that's enormous. Another is, for the first time, we're getting close to having a non-white majority in the United States, which we've never had before. We're from Philadelphia before, and we're accustomed to a non-white majority. It works very well in Philadelphia. But that's a big change. I think that's a big change for the country. You just have covered age differences very, very well. And finally, you hadn't discussed directly the wide disparity in income between the top and the bottom. And this list sort of goes on and on. It's amazing the number of things. And I wonder if you'd comment on some of them.
Do you want to go, John?
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, the immigration, that's sort of in the model, so to speak, in the sense that this ties directly into the racial scapegoating that I was talking about. Immigration, white backlash, concern that whites are going to be a minority, and so on and so forth. That's part and parcel of the same thing. The technology piece, I agree, that's really important. That also ties into the economic piece, right? Part of the reason why wages have stagnated, part of the reason why inequality has gone up so much is because as a result of technological changes in transportation and telecommunications in particular, you get the ability to outsource like crazy. And so you can either automate the job or you can outsource the job, and that squeezes the middle class and the working class in particular.
Yeah, and I would add to that just, I think those changes that you just mentioned might exacerbate some of these urban-rural divides, right? It's kind of, you might think of winners and losers in globalization, winners and losers in the recent economy would be one way of thinking about it. and I don't want to sound like everything has a historical echo, right? Mark Twain famously said, it doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. But the 1920s, I do think the 1920s is what we should all be looking at. I'm like thinking of teaching a course on this next year. Gap between rich and poor, enormous in the 1920s, right? I mean, there's the Great Depression looming right around the corner. Nativism is huge in the 1920s. And that nativism in particular, the rise of the second Klan. So the first Klan's Reconstruction, it gets shut down in the 70s, but the second Klan is anti-black, anti-immigrant, anti-Jew, anti-Catholic, anti-feminist, right? Anti-Hollywood. I mean, it's sort of this whole bundle of traditional values versus sort of modern, cosmopolitan, urban values. And I think that there's something to look to there for how that plays out.
I can add to what I said just very quickly. Some of these are just start.
Mm-hmm.
Talk about the future. In general, we're only at the beginning of that change. I'm not asking you to predict the future, but the future is pretty staggering.
Yeah. Can I say one more thing about the inequality issue? The exit polls from the presidential election, which are, take it all with a grain of salt, but the crude distinction in upper and lower income groups, not that big of a difference in who voted for Trump or who voted for Clinton. The huge difference, though, was in people's perception about future prospects for the next generation. If you were pessimistic about your kids' future, you were going for Trump like crazy. I mean, 80-90% went for Trump on that one. So, I mean, it's obviously related, but there is, I think, an important distinction to be made between the two.
Yeah. And education should be folded in there as well. That's another from the exit polls. And again, the exit polls are, not super reliable, but the gap between college-educated white men and college-educated white women and non-college educated white men and white women are also staggering.
Professor Butler, you made me think that, and this doesn't really call for a prediction,
Good,
but
'cause historians don't
what
do this.
happened right after the 20s, and not just here, but in Germany, and what is happening now, our democracy is safe, of course it's us, how could it go anything else? It doesn't always feel that way. It feels like the way we've created our system was not expecting someone like Trump in the office, because there's not a lot of safeguards personally. He has a lot of power. So do you have a sense, each of you, of what is the likelihood, what could be down the road that we all can never happen here, but it happens, and it happened. So I thought your comment about the 20s was very interesting. What do you think?
I mean, I think that, I'm not going to predict, but I would say the norm violation, again, we do have a system that at least at the executive level, a lot of it's based on norms, right? They're not hard and fast rules because we never contemplated having to pass laws saying things, right? So, I mean, I just, I advocate lots of thumb sucking and fetal position is sort of how I deal with this question of democratic norm erosion. I think it's very frightening, and that is a global story as well. We are seeing democratic norm erosion and the processes and procedures of democracy being called into question really around the world, and it's super frightening.
But what you're seeing is a large number of citizens in this country think democracy isn't working, and they're not in favor of it. It was a disturbingly large number. Now, when I teach Gov 3, which is Intro to American Politics, we spend a lot of time talking about how the presidency is a fundamentally weak office, at least on paper.
Mm-hmm.
And what's happened with the presidency is, of course, successive generations, when they've gotten frustrated with the gridlock in Congress because it's so locally based, they've turned to the president for solving problems. And then over time, you have this accumulation of authorities. That's actually congressional authority that's been delegated to the president. And it's been done in kind of a piecemeal way. It's been done often in response to popular demand. Do something, okay, we'll give the president the power to make it happen. And we're reaping the fruits of heedlessness. And if you want to read, I think one of the best books on this is a Cato publication called The Cult of the Presidency. And it starts with the progressives who are trying to get over have a more modern, technically sophisticated administration, but it's bred some unhappy results right now.
Well, let me add, I think the framers got some things right when they divided power across the legislative, executive, and judicial branches and across federal, state, and local government. And for our daily lives, local and state government still matters a lot more than federal government. And the Democrats out there should take some solace in the fact that Democrats gained a lot in state legislatures and governorships. The power of the states, I mean, can you imagine the Democrats now becoming the states' rights party? But I can see it happening because we're splitting into the blue coasts and the red center. And I can imagine a lot of both sides thinking that the states are a pretty good political institution.
So can I just add also to the story of the presidency, Linda, I think it was the story of the Supreme Court as well, which is also the least democratic in terms of its responsiveness to representative government, right? You're there for life. That's a story that you could think of maybe, I don't know, at least for people on the left, starting in the 50s with civil rights, right, Brown v. Board, but this reliance on the court rather than on Congress. Rather than on building democratic majorities, I think we are reaping what we sow on that. And I'm hoping this kind of seeding the ground of young people running for office and turning out, it's going to make democracy sexy and cool again. And among young people, I think that's what it's going to take, is for young people to really feel invested and committed in the system in a way that it trickles up then to the rest of us.
Now you can do your question.
Sorry.
Ethan Woodard. So this is maybe a bit of a left turn, but you've talked a lot about how the rural-urban divide has sort of crystallized a lot of the long-term trends and has led to the polarization maybe that we see today. So my question would be, is there a historical precedence for this in America? If not in America, somewhere else? And if there was, in the end, how did it resolve itself? And do you think that that would be applicable for the future here in America?
The urban-rural divide has been the most important political divide in America from the very beginning. The Democratic Party and the Whig Party, I mean, it was, when mass-based political parties started with Jackson, Andrew Jackson, he was organizing the rural western areas, which are the Appalachians, against the urban interests. There's a great book called 5 Points about the 5 Points area in New York. The book the movie Gangs of New York is modeled after this, but really the historical case was the 1820s, where people in New York City would complain that when they took carriage rides, the drivers didn't speak English and had a strange religion that was inconsistent with democracy. They were talking about Irish Catholics. So the more things, I mean, there's almost a historical precedent for everything that we see today, and the rural-urban divide has been the most important divide in America politically since the beginning.
I need to also throw in Europe on this, because that plays very big in Europe, and particularly in terms of the current rightward shift. I mean, Poland, Hungary, France, Brexit was very much a part of rural-urban divide issues. So this is not just an American phenomenon, and it plays big in a lot of different countries, for better or worse.
The 20s are the big moment for it, I think, actually. That's when you actually have more people moving to cities. The numbers change pretty considerably in the 1920s, that we have a shift to an urban rather than agrarian population. And that's where you see a lot of this nativism I talked about, which is not just targeted at African Americans, but at young people, flappers, movie culture, Hollywood, Jews, Catholic. There's a whole range of issues that all get sort of lumped with urban cosmopolitan values versus rural. So I do think it gets worse.
And the rural-urban divide is undeniably correlated with race.
Especially in the 20th century.
So how did it resolve then?
We live in it now. We're living it now.
And what you're seeing now, of course, is it's baked into the Electoral College. Right now,
Absolutely.
Democrats have to win 9 or 10% more of the national popular vote for their party in order to get a majority of the seats that you've had in 3 out of the last 5 congressional elections. The Democrats have actually gotten more votes nationally and not controlled the House of Representatives. We've had how many presidential elections?
4 out of the last 5, right?
Where the popular vote was skewed. And one of the things that's going to fix it is that people at places like Dartmouth have to start moving to Topeka. Because there's a lot of, because of this urban-rural connection, you have people who are more likely to identify with a globalist perspective or whatever. They're concentrated on the coast. And so there are a lot of Democratic votes that get cast for president and for House member that are effectively wasted. Takes too many, there are too many votes, and Republicans, because so much of the interior of the country is less populated, they're more efficiently spread to control political outcomes.
And this is something people have complained about. I just taught Lincoln's speech at Peoria, 1854, yesterday, and he's not complaining about it because he's a constitutionalist. He says these are the rules that we abide by, but within these rules, a white South Carolinian counts for 2 white Mainers, right? Because of the 3/5 compromise, because of the black population, that even though they're not enfranchised, they get to count towards representation. So this is an issue obviously from the founding, but it does seem to be exacerbating because of places like LA and New York, Chicago, Houston.
Do we have some questioners back there? There's one in the blue shirt.
Hi, so I just have a question about the fact that, as it seemed like Democrats ran the table in the suburbs, they lost 2 Senate seats that were supposed to be highly contested in Indiana and Missouri, but ended up not being very competitive. I was wondering if you think that any of the trends in the midterm election could be interpreted more as a referendum on President Trump or as a long-term alignment in the U.S. Political system.
Well, those Republican seats probably shouldn't have been in Democratic hands. They got there because of the 2012 election and the extraordinary electoral mobilization of the Obama administration. So you could say that in many ways, if senators had, say, 4-year terms or 2-year terms, those, particularly Indiana, would have reverted to Republican hands. And so those Democrats just had the ill fortune of being elected at a time that was very favorable to Democrats nationally. So I don't know how much we can really read into those.
Yeah, the base, most of the vote is explained by party affiliation, demographic characteristics, where you live, and then the referendum on Trump was just the icing on the cake.
I'm going to take a question here. Also kind of going off of that, because we saw a record number of women not only turning out to vote, but running themselves, and more than 100 women in the House of Representatives, do you think that this is just a reaction to Trump, or this is a long-term change that we'll see more women and maybe, dare I say, equality in the House of Representatives and in the legislature when it comes to women in politics?
I would say it's both. I think it was a reaction to Trump because I think it was organized fairly consciously right after. But I do think it's long-term. Democracy is a habit. It's a muscle, right? You learn it, you work it. This goes back to Alexis de Tocqueville, right? We learn the habits of democracy by engaging in democracy. Self-governance can't be taught. It has to be learned on the job. And so I think the habit of it, and then of people voting for people, what's the impact of voting of women in their 20s, millennial women voting for a 29-year-old woman? I think it has a way of spiraling out, and I think if you develop the habit early, I think it sticks. I think it's a sticky habit. I hope it's a sticky habit.
Yeah, it's a continuation of a trend that started decades ago and that will increase in the decades to come, and it's not really due to Trump.
No, but what you see are the number of women sort of plateaus, and then you get a bump.
Spike,
so you get a shock to the system that really arouses women's interest in politics, like the Anita Hill testimony back in the
90s. Yeah, 92, right?
92, whenever
the year of the woman, as we call it.
And but what you have to remember is that it's very costly to individuals to become candidates in our system because our parties are relatively weak. They don't have a lot of resources to groom people. People have to raise their own money. They have to put together their own volunteer operation. And still in our society, women maybe have less free time to devote to politics, or they feel, rightly or wrongly, that the cost to their families are more severe than if the man does it. And I think I don't know if that's accurate or not, but you certainly see those perceptions still with women. And there still are, you still see some survey evidence that women think that it's not a level playing field for them, that they'll have trouble raising money, and that they won't be treated equally by the electorate. As it happens, when women run, they win.
Yeah, this
All
is why
else-
that organization, Run for Something, they provide all these services, which is why this was a significant innovation, because they provide consultants and messaging experts. I mean, all the apparatus that helps you make that first step. So if anyone, young people who are thinking of running, I know already have that culture, but that's a really good organization to look into.
I think we have a question down here and then here.
Hi, I'm Zach. I'm a 65. No, I'm just kidding. I'm a 22. Yeah, so I have a few different questions, but I'd like to just kind of build off of that last one. Something that I've been thinking about is how it's a recent trend, right, that more women are in higher education than men. I mean, Dartmouth this year our class is 53% women, I think 47% men. I think that's pretty indicative of the overall trend in higher education. And so my question with that is, specifically since we're talking about politics right now, but also, I mean, it goes into, talking about Fortune 500 CEOs, the wage gap, other gaps where men are, disproportionately represented in these like power positions, you might call them. Do you think that might change because of this recent trend of women being in higher education, and higher education really being indicative of what defines those gaps in the first place? Maybe that education is the path to equality for women.
We'll know in 25 years, won't we?
But the reality is that the recent numbers that I've seen are that in terms of higher education graduation rates, it's a dead heat almost between men and women. Yeah.
Do you think that'll change, do you think the trend where more women are in higher education is going to continue, and then maybe eventually women will surpass graduation?
Yeah, but I'm saying at the moment, it's not the case. It's a dead heat now. And women have closed the gap over the last, I think it's since 1960, the most recent, or the latest data that I'm familiar with. Whether they then step ahead, it's a good question, I don't know.
Okay, we've got somebody over here.
Well, the mic's being passed. Let me say that's also, education is a path to equality for everybody, but the rise of like two-income families is contributing to income inequality.
Right.
People meet in college, they get great jobs, and you're kind of doubling the incomes of families now, and that's contributing to income inequality.
Hi, I'm Shadi. I'm a 22, and I was wondering, given what you mentioned previously, Professor, about the erosion of the moderate candidate, how do you see the future of voting in terms of interacting with two very different polarizing candidates, given that we're very often a two-party country, two-party system? How do you see people from all ages, all demographics, interacting with two very different candidates, as opposed to back in even 2008, where we had Barack Obama and John McCain, who were two very different candidates in terms of values, but were both very humanizing and respected one another, like often and very publicly. How do you see that difference affecting our politics, and do you see perhaps maybe something like what was instituted in Maine recently, a ranked choice voting, maybe implemented across the country on a wider scale, especially in places like Texas, where Ted Cruz won much less handily this year than he did last time he ran?
Well, there are a lot of questions in that question, so I'll just pick one. To me, what I worry about is as polarization gets more severe, that it will just turn people off from politics. that people will just say, oh, they're not different. They're absolutely alike in that they're so polarized and all they do is fight all the time. And I think that that kind of polarization really kind of gives people justification for not being influenced in politics. I hear that a lot. And so what was kind of interesting to me about this election was that the polarization actually energized people rather than turning them off. But I don't think we can assume that in going forward.
My question was somewhat similar, but I should identify myself. I'm probably the only non-Dartmouth person here. I'm a Yale graduate. Ours. I can remember back in the 50s when I first began to get interested in politics, one of the things that was turning young people off was that both the parties seemed so much the same. We used to talk about Tweedledee and Tweedledum. Yeah. So that's a reminder to be careful what we wish for. But I'm interested in following up your question. What do you think the future of this ranked choice voting is? I know California is using it, I think. And there's that district in Maine where I think the vote has not been determined yet because they're now going to the second round. But do you see that as a way of perhaps moderating some of the polarization?
Well, ranked choice voting only works if you get a third or fourth party candidate on the ballot. And there's so many barriers to third party candidates getting elected, from fundraising to the way ballots are counted. Yeah, and if we, there's just so many barriers to third-party candidates. If the parties move far enough apart, maybe there's an opening for a third-party candidate. And another alternative is approval voting, where you can go in and just check mark, vote for every candidate you want to in a multi-candidate race, which political scientists have liked for a long time because it ends the problems of overvoting. That is, people who vote for two candidates in the same office, their ballots spoiled. There were like 60,000 of those in Florida in that 2000 election. But electoral reform to me is, I always thought that we would abolish the Electoral College after the last case in which the Electoral College chose someone other than the popular vote winner. And that was in 2000. I thought we'd abolish the Electoral College. We didn't. So I don't have a lot of optimism for any kind of electoral reform.
But isn't it the case that there are a couple of states now on the Electoral College that have gone to proportional distribution? Yeah. And if that catches fire, at least insofar as presidential politics is concerned, that would begin to move in the right direction.
You have to get
Nebraska and Maine, I think, are the two, right?
New Jersey was the first to do that, and basically they have a state law that says that if enough other states do this, they will all pool their votes and basically cast their Electoral College votes consistent with the majority vote winner. But they don't have enough states to do it.
The trick is getting enough states to buy into that compact, and Ohio and Florida would say, not us, we like the spotlight.
Okay, we have time for one more, and then we'll be done.
No pressure.
Thank you so much for all of your insights. I want to ask you more about the polarization issue. I'm Erica. I'm a 96. I find it fascinating how people place different landmarks on the road to polarization that we find ourselves in now. Democrats abandoning the working class, Obama, the financial crisis. One of my first political memories, 1991, kind of echoing what Lars was saying, was they were talking about George Bush I and Clinton and saying, how will these candidates distinguish them from each other? Their positions are so similar. So from kind of 1991 to now, what a different picture. Even as I'm so baffled by what I see to be people voting against their economic interest and against clean air and water. And I wanted to kind of just push you to help me understand a little bit better how we got to this polarization, and maybe suggesting one answer. And to what extent do you think that, to draw on Leslie's post-shame, bad faith operating is the answer, both in politics, I'm thinking of Newt Gingrich and Karl Rove, and in media and messaging? To what extent is it important to make lying wrong again? would you propose legislation towards that effect?
Second.
I think that the primaries are the real villain in this polarization. We didn't used to pick our congressional candidates with direct primaries. That really didn't start until the mid-1980s, and I think it's no accident that as we've relied more and more on primaries to choose Senate candidates and House candidates and state legislative candidates, we've basically created a situation where the extremists, the activists in both parties, and the donors in both parties have pushed the elites apart. And there's a big debate in political science now whether the electorate was polarizing at the same time or whether the electorate has been pulled apart because of the polarization of elites. I'm a believer that it was elite polarization that came first and just pushed candidates. But basically, once the nominations are in place, you're faced with the problem that this young woman was, that you might not like either one of them. And the fact of the matter is the people who make those choices are very unrepresentative of most of us. Okay, I think we should call it a night. Thank you to the staff at the Rockefeller Center for all that they do in bringing us together. Thank you.